Case 1. Marcel Pongratz was 28 years old when he went out on Halloween night in Taylor, Michigan, expecting nothing more than music, drinks, and time with friends. He arrived at Big League Brews during a crowded Halloween gathering, a night when costumes filled the bar, and the energy stayed high well past midnight. Friends later said Marcel was in a good mood and had no reason to think the night would turn dangerous. By the end of that night, however, he would be fatally wounded, and his death would become part of a criminal case that exposed how fast a bar dispute can turn deadly. According to police reports and court records, the trouble started inside the bar, not outside. Investigators confirmed that an argument broke out involving Marcel Pongratz and other patrons over a woman. The disagreement grew heated enough that bar staff stepped in. Witnesses told police that several people involved were acting unruly, and employees decided to remove them from the bar. Security escorted those involved out of the building, directing them toward the rear area of the property. What could have ended with everyone walking away did not stop there. The confrontation followed them into the back parking lot, away from the main entrance and the crowd inside. In that parking lot, the situation turned violent. Police records state that during the continued confrontation, Marcel Pongratz was stabbed. The attack happened quickly, with little time for anyone nearby to react. Despite being seriously injured, Marcel did not collapse at the scene. In a desperate attempt to survive, he got into his vehicle and drove himself to Corewell Health Taylor Hospital. Hospital staff recognized the severity of his injuries and arranged for him to be transferred for higher-level care. Despite those efforts, Marcel Pongratz later died from his wounds, just after midnight on October 26, 2024. His ability to seek help on his own became a key detail in the investigation, underscoring how sudden and chaotic the attack was. Police immediately began canvassing the area, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing security footage from the bar and surrounding locations. Their investigation quickly focused on William David Parker, a 40-year-old man who had also been involved in the disturbance. Officers tracked Parker's movements in the hours after the stabbing. Approximately 10 hours after the incident, police located him at a relative's home in Ypsilanti, Michigan. According to arrest reports, officers noted that Parker was still legally intoxicated at the time he was taken into custody. This detail later became part of the prosecution's argument about impaired judgment and reckless behavior. Prosecutors charged Parker with murder, arguing that the stabbing was not an accident and not justified by any threat. In court, they laid out a timeline that began with the argument inside the bar, continued through the ejection of patrons, and ended with the fatal confrontation in the parking lot. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence were presented to show Parker's role in Marcel Pongratz's death. The defense attempted to challenge aspects of the case, but the central facts remained unchanged. A bar dispute escalated, and a man lost his life. After hearing all the evidence, a Wayne County jury convicted William David Parker of second-degree murder. The verdict confirmed that the jury found his actions directly responsible for Marcel's death, even without proof of long-term planning. During sentencing, the court heard emotional statements from Marcel Pongratz's family and friends. They described him as kind, social, and full of plans for the future. They spoke about how a brief argument over something so small had taken everything from them. The judge imposed a lengthy prison sentence, emphasizing that violence in public spaces carries severe consequences. If you'd love to see more murder documentaries on the channel, please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing. Thank you very much. Case 2. Samuel Salace walked into a birthday celebration at Vera's Lounge on the night of December 10, 2022, expecting a social gathering that would last a few hours. The Northwest Side Bar was filled with friends and family marking a milestone. Music played, drinks were poured. Nothing in the early moments suggested the night would become one of Chicago's most devastating bar-related violence cases, one that would continue unfolding years later. Shortly after 1 a.m. on December 11, 2022, tensions inside the bar began to rise. Witnesses later described a heated argument involving multiple people. Voices escalated, and the mood inside the crowded room shifted. Bar staff attempted to intervene, but the confrontation did not end. Instead, it spilled outside onto the sidewalk, where the situation rapidly escalated beyond control. According to prosecutors, once outside, Samuel Salace, then 32 years old, pulled out a handgun. What followed was not described as a single impulsive act. Authorities allege he fired multiple shots at close range, striking several people in rapid succession. Ricky Vera, 50, Mario Pozuelos, 26, and Mercedes Tavares, 24, were all shot and later pronounced dead. A fourth victim, Mariah Vera, 25, suffered catastrophic gunshot injuries and was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Surveillance footage and witness accounts became central to the investigation. Prosecutors told the court that the evidence showed continued gunfire even after some victims were already on the ground. The sidewalk outside the bar became an active crime scene, with shell casings scattered and first responders arriving within minutes. For families waiting at home, the night ended with phone calls that changed their lives permanently. The violence did not stop at the scene. Prosecutors alleged that Samuel Salace fled in a vehicle with his girlfriend, holding her against her will and forcing her to drive him away from the bar. This allegation formed the basis of the kidnapping charge, which specifically refers to unlawful restraint through force and threat while fleeing the scene. Court records later confirmed this was not a random victim, but an intimate partner allegedly placed in danger during the escape. Police located and arrested Salace later that day without further violence. In the days that followed, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office filed 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with 1 count of attempted first-degree murder related to Mariah Vera's injuries. Additional charges included kidnapping, aggravated battery, and aggravated unlawful restraint, reflecting the full scope of conduct prosecutors say occurred during and after the shooting. Prosecutors also disclosed that Salace was on parole at the time of the shooting, a factor that played heavily into bond arguments and public concern. During early court hearings, prosecutors argued that the sequence of events, multiple victims, continued gunfire, and the forced escape demonstrated a clear danger to the community. As the case moved forward, further damaging details emerged in court. Prosecutors revealed that Salace made third-party admissions after the shooting. According to court statements, he apologized for killing Mercedes Tavares and claimed he shot everyone who called out his name. Prosecutors cited these statements as evidence of intent and awareness, strengthening their case ahead of trial. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Family members of the victims attended hearings, listening as charges were read and evidence summarized. Ricky Vera was remembered as a father and a central figure connected to the bar. Mario Pozuelos and Mercedes Tavares were young adults whose lives ended outside a celebration meant to be safe. For Mariah Vera's family, the suffering did not end with the shooting. By late 2025, Mariah Vera's condition had deteriorated further. Her family announced that doctors had confirmed her brain function would not return, and she was transitioned into terminal care. Some records and family statements indicate she was laid to rest in August 2025, following her move into hospice. If officially confirmed in court, prosecutors stated they would upgrade the attempted murder charge to a 4th count of first-degree murder. This medical uncertainty had a direct impact on the legal process. As of early 2026, the trial has faced delays, not due to lack of evidence, but because the outcome of Mariah Vera's condition determines the ultimate charges. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office acknowledged that proceeding without charge finality could compromise the integrity of the trial, leading the court to pause proceedings. Case 3. Christopher Foley was 29 years old when a late-night argument outside a Louisville bar turned into a homicide case that now sits before the courts. On Sunday, June 22, 2025, the dispute happened outside the Corner Tavern. By the next morning, Foley was in court for an arraignment hearing. Prosecutors accused him of playing a role in an assault that caused deadly injuries. As investigators gathered evidence and witnesses came forward, the case grew more complex, with shifting charges and competing accounts of what happened in just a few critical minutes. Police records and later news reports identified the victim as Douglas Holliger, sometimes spelled Holliger, a 48-year-old man who had been at the bar that night. According to investigators, the confrontation did not begin as a random disagreement. Police say the argument centered on money that Foley claimed Holliger owed him. What started as a verbal dispute inside or near the bar soon moved outside onto Mount Washington Road, where emotions were high and the situation escalated quickly. Surveillance video became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Detectives say footage from the area shows Foley throwing Holliger to the ground and striking him multiple times. Prosecutors allege that during this physical struggle, Holliger suffered severe head injuries. Emergency medical crews rushed him to a hospital, but despite treatment, he later died from those injuries. Investigators concluded that the trauma to his head was the direct cause of death, turning what some might see as a brief fight into a fatal event. Foley was arrested later that same day. On Monday morning, June 23, 2025, he appeared in court for his arraignment. At that hearing, a judge formally read the charge and set Foley's bond at $250,000 cash. At that stage, Foley was charged with murder, a charge that reflects the seriousness of the outcome rather than the length of the confrontation. As with all criminal cases, Foley was presumed innocent, and the arraignment marked only the first step in a longer legal process. As the investigation continued, police arrested a second man, Ronnie Watkins, age 30. Authorities alleged that Watkins was also involved in the fight outside the Corner Tavern. Prosecutors charged Watkins with murder as well, stating that his actions contributed to the injuries that led to Holliger's death. The presence of a second defendant raised key questions about who delivered which blows and how responsibility should be shared under the law. During a subsequent court hearing on July 1, 2025, prosecutors amended Foley's charge to complicity to murder. This change did not remove the seriousness of the accusation, but it reflected the state's position that Foley may not have acted alone. Foley's defense attorney laid out a more detailed argument at that hearing. Rather than simply pointing to conflicting witness statements, the defense claimed that Foley and Holliger were mutual combatants. According to the defense, Foley initially knocked Holliger to the ground during the argument over money. The attorney argued that Holliger then got back up and continued the confrontation. The defense further claimed that a second individual, identified as Watkins, struck Holliger afterward, and that this later blow caused the fatal head injury. This argument directly challenges the prosecution's version of events and places the focus on timing, sequence, and medical evidence. Prosecutors, however, have pointed to surveillance footage and witness statements to support their case. They argue that Foley's actions were aggressive and dangerous, and that the injuries Holliger suffered were a foreseeable result of being thrown to the ground and struck repeatedly. The state maintains that even if more than one person was involved, Foley can still be held responsible under a complicity theory if his actions helped set the deadly chain of events in motion. As the case moves forward, judges and jurors will weigh surveillance video, medical testimony, and eyewitness accounts. They will consider whether the fight over money escalated into criminal behavior that meets the legal definition of murder or complicity to murder. Don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Case 4. Daniel Martinez became the center of a homicide investigation after a late-night argument at a bar in Amarillo, Texas, turned deadly on October 29, 2023. According to police records, the incident unfolded at Las Alazanas, located in the 2800 block of East Amarillo Boulevard. What began as a heated exchange inside the bar escalated with alarming speed. By the time officers were formally dispatched at 10:20 p.m., a 31-year-old man, Jose Gerardo Morales Zavala, had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. Martinez, who was 18 years old at the time, would soon be arrested and charged with murder, setting off a case shaped not only by the violence of that night, but by his legal history as well. Investigators determined that the confrontation started inside the crowded bar where Martinez and Morales Zavala were seen arguing. Witnesses told police that voices were raised and the disagreement drew attention from nearby patrons. Surveillance footage later confirmed that Martinez left the bar during the dispute. For a brief moment, it appeared the conflict might end there. That pause, however, was short-lived. Authorities say Martinez returned to Las Alazanas not long after leaving. It was during this return that the argument turned fatal. A major development in the case came from eyewitness testimony. In addition to the surveillance video, police identified a female witness who personally knew Martinez. According to court records, she told investigators that she saw Martinez shoot Morales Zavala. Her statement became a critical piece of evidence, directly linking Martinez to the shooting. Officers responding to the scene found Morales Zavala lying on the floor inside the bar. Despite emergency efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Police reports show that officers were officially dispatched to the location at 10:20 p.m., responding to calls reporting a shooting. The bar was quickly secured as a crime scene, and detectives began collecting statements and reviewing video footage. Within hours, Martinez was identified as the primary suspect. Later that night, officers located him at a residence in Amarillo. Reports indicate there was a brief standoff before Martinez was taken into custody without further violence. He was booked into the Potter County Jail and formally charged with murder. As the investigation moved forward, prosecutors highlighted an important piece of background that added serious weight to the case. At the time of the shooting, Martinez was already on probation. Court records show that he had been convicted of aggravated robbery stemming from an incident in November 2022. Martinez pleaded guilty to that charge in March 2023, just months before the bar shooting. This probation status meant Martinez was already under court supervision when the fatal confrontation occurred, a factor that would later influence how the case was viewed by prosecutors and the court. Authorities also noted that Martinez was under the legal drinking age, raising further questions about how the situation developed inside the bar. Investigators assembled a detailed timeline using surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence. Particular focus was placed on Martinez's decision to leave the bar and then return shortly before the shooting, a sequence prosecutors argued showed a clear break in events before the violence resumed. Following Martinez's indictment, the court addressed his custody status. His bond was set at $400,000, reflecting both the seriousness of the charge and his prior criminal history. Prosecutors argued that the bond amount was necessary given the violent nature of the offense and Martinez's existing probation for aggravated robbery. The bond decision ensured Martinez would remain in custody unless the substantial amount was posted as the case moved through the court system. Case 5. Cleveland Mcinty, Leon Woods, and Tron Mcinty became the focus of a murder case after a bar argument in West London escalated into fatal violence outside the Old Hat pub in West Ealing on April 6, 2024. What began as a minor dispute over a chair inside the pub ended with the death of 39-year-old Mark Bars, an ex-soldier who had previously served in Afghanistan. By the end of the evening, one man had lost his life, 3 brothers had lost their freedom, and a familiar local pub had become the center of a major criminal case. Court evidence showed that the initial disagreement inside the Old Hat was brief and ordinary in appearance. Mark Bars became involved in a dispute with Leon Woods, then 42 years old, over seating inside the crowded pub. Witnesses described raised voices, but nothing that immediately suggested serious violence. Bars moved away from the argument and went outside. For a short moment, it appeared the situation might end there. But instead of disengaging, the situation shifted. CCTV footage presented at trial showed Leon Woods leaving the pub and going to his car, reaching inside before returning to the area outside the Old Hat. Shortly afterward, Woods contacted his 2 brothers, Cleveland Mcinty, aged 40, and Tron Mcinty, aged 35, asking them to come to the scene. This sequence became a critical point in the prosecution's case, showing a clear escalation rather than a spontaneous continuation of the original dispute. When Cleveland Mcinty and Tron Mcinty arrived, the confrontation resumed outside the pub and quickly intensified. The argument moved away from the main entrance toward a bin storage area, partially shielded from view. Witnesses described shouting and pushing as tensions escalated. Police were called at 7:46 p.m., reporting a disturbance outside the pub. Before officers could arrive, the violence reached its fatal conclusion. During the confrontation near the bin area, Cleveland Mcinty stabbed Mark Bars once in the chest. The wound was catastrophic. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but Bars was pronounced dead at the scene. The violence itself lasted only moments, yet the consequences were permanent. Investigators immediately secured the area and began collecting witness statements and reviewing CCTV footage from multiple angles around the pub. The CCTV evidence played a central role in the case. Footage showed all three brothers present during the confrontation and captured Cleveland Mcinty holding a knife shortly before the stabbing. Prosecutors told the court that the video, combined with witness testimony, established a clear timeline, from the chair dispute inside the pub to Leon Woods' trip to his car, to the arrival of the brothers and the fatal encounter in the bin storage area. All three men were arrested on April 10, 2024, 4 days after the stabbing, and formally charged the following day. Initially, Cleveland Mcinty, Leon Woods, and Tron Mcinty were all placed on trial for murder, reflecting the seriousness of the incident and the group nature of the violence. At that stage, prosecutors argued that each brother bore responsibility for the events that led to Bars's death. As the case progressed, the legal positions of the brothers shifted. Leon Woods pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and Tron Mcinty pleaded guilty to violent disorder. Following those pleas, the murder charges against Woods and Tron Mcinty were formally cleared, leaving Cleveland Mcinty as the sole defendant facing a murder conviction. The court accepted that while Woods and Tron Mcinty played significant roles in escalating the violence, only Cleveland Mcinty carried responsibility for the fatal stabbing itself. During sentencing, the judge addressed each brother individually. Cleveland Mcinty, who pleaded guilty to murder, received the most severe sentence. The court explained that the standard minimum term for the offense was 23 years, but formally sentenced him to 22 years and 32 days to account for 333 days already served on remand. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with that adjusted minimum term required before parole could be considered. The judge emphasized that using a knife in a public place demonstrated a complete disregard for life. Leon Woods was sentenced to 7 years in prison for manslaughter. While he did not deliver the fatal blow, the court found his actions pivotal. The judge highlighted Woods' role in reigniting the dispute, going to his car and calling his brothers to the scene, all of which directly contributed to the fatal outcome. Tron Mcinty, who pleaded guilty to violent disorder, was sentenced to 12 months in prison. The court acknowledged his role was less direct, but stressed that participating in group violence carries serious responsibility, particularly when it leads to a death. Throughout the sentencing, the court repeatedly referenced Mark Bars's background. Bars was described as a former soldier who had served in Afghanistan, a man whose life ended over a dispute that began with something as minor as a chair. The judge noted that no sentence could restore what had been lost, but accountability was essential. Case 6. Addie Whiting stepped outside the Carpenter's Arms late on the night of January 14, 2024. As the pub's manager, he was responsible for keeping order when tensions rose. Friends and colleagues later told the court this was something he took seriously. He was not looking for confrontation. He was trying to prevent one. The disturbance that drew Whiting outside was not a crowd fight. Court evidence made clear the conflict involved Maxim Ilyev and his partner, Katya Sonova. Witnesses described a heated domestic argument on the street outside the pub. Voices were raised, and the situation appeared volatile, though still contained between the couple. Concerned the argument could escalate or spill back into the pub, Whiting decided to intervene. Before stepping outside, he retrieved a metal bat from pub storage. Prosecutors later explained that Whiting intended to use the bat as a deterrent, not as a weapon. He believed that the presence of the object would help him keep distance and assert authority while he tried to separate the couple and calm the situation. Once outside, Whiting positioned himself between Ilyev and Sonova. The court heard that he prodded Ilyev with the bat, using it to push him back and discourage further aggression. This detail became an important part of the trial. Judges and jurors were clear that Whiting's actions were not flawless. He was not a passive bystander, but prosecutors emphasized that his intent was control, not violence. The confrontation escalated quickly. During a brief struggle, Ilyev overpowered Whiting and disarmed him, taking the bat away. In that moment, the balance of the encounter shifted completely. Prosecutors told the court that once Ilyev had possession of the bat, Whiting was exposed and vulnerable. Ilyev then struck Whiting in the head with force, causing devastating injuries. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics treated Whiting at the scene and transported him to hospital in critical condition. Contrary to some early assumptions, Addie Whiting did not die that night. He remained hospitalized for 10 days, suffering severe brain injuries. His family stayed at his bedside, hoping for recovery as doctors worked to manage the damage caused by the blow. On January 24, 2024, Addie Whiting died in hospital. He was 35 years old. His death formally escalated the case from a serious assault to murder, deepening the shock felt across Boston, Lincolnshire. Tributes quickly appeared outside the Carpenter's Arms. Family, friends, and regular customers described Whiting as dependable, calm, and protective of others, a man who stepped in because he felt responsible for the safety of those around him. Lincolnshire police launched a full investigation, supported by CCTV footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence. The case proceeded to trial at Lincoln Crown Court, where jurors heard a detailed reconstruction of the events leading up to Whiting's death. Prosecutors acknowledged that Whiting introduced the bat into the situation, but argued decisively that Ilyev's act of disarming him and delivering the fatal blow was the direct cause of death. The trial also revealed what happened after the attack. Prosecutors told the court that Ilyev attempted to flee the United Kingdom. Within hours of the assault, he was tracked to London Luton Airport, where police arrested him at the departure gates, just minutes before he was due to board a flight to Bulgaria. The timing of the arrest was critical. Prosecutors argued that Ilyev was actively trying to evade justice rather than seek help for the injured man. The court also examined the actions of others following the attack. Katya Tsonova was convicted of assisting an offender after evidence showed she attempted to help Ilyev flee the country. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Prosecutors said her actions were aimed at avoiding accountability, not aiding the victim. A third individual, Rumen Dambinov, was also convicted of assisting Ilyev's attempted escape. The court heard that Dambinov played a supporting role in efforts to help Ilyev leave the UK. He was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. For the main attack, Maxim Ilyev was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years before parole can be considered. During sentencing, the judge described the killing as a grave and irreversible act of violence against a man who was trying to restore order. While acknowledging that Whiting's judgment was imperfect, the court made clear that responsibility for the fatal outcome rested squarely with Ilyev. Case 7. Adam Finelli was 39 years old when a night of celebration nearby turned into violence that reached his front door. In the early hours of Sunday, November 13, 2022, Finelli was at home in Houghton Regis, Bedfordshire, unaware that within seconds his life would be taken in an outbreak of violence later described by prosecutors and a judge as senseless and truly extraordinary. By the end of that brief window, Finelli and Patrick Howard, 27, were dead, and Mason Jordan, 26, had survived 8 stab wounds. The chain of events began hours earlier on the night of Saturday, November 12, 2022, when a group of friends gathered at a local pub to celebrate a baby shower. Patrick Howard and Mason Jordan were part of that group. Alcohol was consumed, and as the night wore on, tensions developed between them and another group of men. What began as verbal confrontation did not remain contained inside the pub or fade away as people left. Instead, the disagreement spilled into nearby residential streets, setting the stage for what would follow. As the groups encountered each other again outside, the situation escalated rapidly. Investigators later made clear that this was not a simple street fight. Cars were used as weapons, engines were revved aggressively, and people ran in different directions as fear spread. The noise was loud enough to disturb residents. Shouting echoed through the street. Tires screeched. The atmosphere was chaotic, and the danger was immediate. Emergency services were first called to reports of a hit-and-run in the area. But when officers arrived, they quickly realized the scene was far worse. What initially sounded like a traffic incident was in fact a mass stabbing, with multiple victims lying injured in the roadway. Police would later describe those first moments as confusing and urgent, as the scale of the violence only became clear once the scene was secured. According to evidence presented in court, Anthony Benison, then 25, was armed with a knife. During a burst of violence lasting just 20 to 30 seconds, Benison stabbed Patrick Howard in the neck. The wound immediately paralyzed him, leaving him helpless on the road. Prosecutors described this moment as pivotal, marking the point at which Howard's fate was sealed. What followed shocked the courtroom. Nicholas Papworth, 33, then got into a car and drove over Patrick Howard, dragging him several meters underneath the vehicle. The use of the car was not incidental. Prosecutors argued it was deliberate and sustained. The combined injuries from the stabbing and the vehicle proved fatal. Patrick Howard had no chance to escape. Nearby, Mason Jordan was also attacked. He was stabbed 8 times during the same short burst of violence. Despite the severity of his injuries, Jordan survived after emergency surgery and intensive hospital treatment. His survival was later described as the result of rapid medical response rather than any lack of force or intent during the attack. Adam Finelli's death followed a different and deeply troubling path. Evidence showed that Finelli was not involved in the pub dispute at all. He had been at home when he heard the shouting, the revving engines, and the disturbance outside. Concerned by the noise in his street, he stepped outside to see what was happening. Prosecutors told the court that Finelli walked directly into the unfolding violence and was stabbed twice in the chest. He had no opportunity to defend himself. The injuries were fatal. Police and paramedics arriving at the scene were confronted with devastation. Finelli and Howard were pronounced dead from their injuries. Jordan was rushed to hospital, where doctors worked to save his life. Detectives launched a major investigation, piecing together CCTV footage, forensic evidence, witness accounts, and vehicle movements to reconstruct what had happened in those few critical seconds. Throughout the trial, the short time frame of the violence became a central theme. Investigators and the judge repeatedly referred to the 20 to 30-second window in which multiple attacks took place as senseless and truly extraordinary. Prosecutors argued that the speed and intensity of the violence showed extreme aggression and a complete disregard for human life. In August 2023, the case reached its conclusion. Anthony Benison was convicted of 2 counts of murder for the killings of Adam Finelli and Patrick Howard. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder and 3 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm with intent. He received a life sentence, with a minimum term of 38 years before parole could be considered. Nicholas Papworth was convicted of the murder of Patrick Howard, along with 2 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm. He was cleared of the murder of Adam Finelli, but the judge described his role in Howard's death as decisive. Papworth was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years. Not all defendants were convicted. Mark Griffith was cleared of all charges by the judge during the trial. Curtis Long had his case dropped before the trial concluded in early 2023. These outcomes reflected the court's careful effort to assign responsibility based on evidence rather than association. Case 8. Jake Balmforth became the central figure in a bar-related manslaughter case after a night of football, alcohol, and rising tension ended in fatal violence on March 4, 2023 in Blackpool, England. What should have been an ordinary evening following a football match instead became a chain of events that exposed how quickly disorder can escalate into tragedy. By May 2025, Balmforth stood convicted of manslaughter and was remanded in custody, ordered to remain behind bars until his sentencing on 22 May 2025. But his case was only one part of a much wider disturbance that night, one that drew multiple people into the criminal justice system. The incident unfolded on Blackpool Promenade after a championship match between Blackpool and Burnley. As supporters left pubs and bars along the seafront, the atmosphere was loud and charged. Alcohol had been flowing, emotions were high, and rival fans crossed paths in close quarters. Among those present was 55-year-old Tony Johnson, a football fan who had spent the evening socializing in the area. Court evidence later showed that tensions flared quickly outside a pub, where a confrontation broke out among a group of men. CCTV footage became a key piece of evidence in what followed. Prosecutors told the jury that the footage showed Jake Balmforth delivering a single punch to Tony Johnson during the disturbance. Johnson fell backward, striking his head on the pavement. Witnesses described the mood shifting instantly as people realized the seriousness of what had happened. Police were called to the scene at approximately 7:46 p.m., responding to reports of violence and an injured man on the promenade. Emergency services arrived, and Johnson was taken to hospital, but his condition rapidly deteriorated. Medical evidence later confirmed that the head injury caused by the fall was fatal. What lasted only seconds on the street became the subject of a lengthy criminal investigation that would stretch over 2 years. Johnson's death transformed what might otherwise have been recorded as football-related disorder into a manslaughter case. Balmforth was arrested and charged. His case was eventually heard at Preston Crown Court, where prosecutors and defense lawyers examined every moment of the confrontation. The prosecution argued that while there was no weapon and only one punch, the force used and the surrounding circumstances made the killing unlawful. The defense emphasized that there was no intent to kill and that the fatal injury resulted from the fall rather than the strike itself. After a 6-day trial, the jury reached its verdict. On 6 May 2025, Balmforth was found guilty of manslaughter. As the verdict was delivered, the judge immediately addressed custody. Given the seriousness of the offense and the fact that a life had been lost, Balmforth was remanded in custody to await sentencing. The court scheduled his sentencing hearing for 22 May 2025, bringing an abrupt end to any prospect of release before punishment was decided. On 22 May 2025, the court returned to impose a sentence. The judge reviewed CCTV footage, medical findings, and the broader context of the disturbance. While acknowledging that the offense involved a single punch and no weapon, the judge stressed that violence in public places, especially where alcohol and hard surfaces are involved, carries obvious and deadly risks. Balmforth was sentenced to 5 years in prison for manslaughter. In addition, the court imposed a 9-year football banning order, reflecting the football-related nature of the disorder that preceded the fatal blow. However, Balmforth's conviction did not mark the end of legal proceedings linked to that night. Court records and later reporting confirmed that 9 other men were also prosecuted in connection with the same disturbance. These included 8 Burnley supporters and 1 Blackpool supporter, all charged with a fray for their roles in the wider violence on the promenade. Their cases were dealt with separately from the manslaughter trial, but stemmed from the same sequence of events. Most of those affray cases concluded in August 2025, more than 2 years after the original incident. Sentences varied depending on each individual's role, criminal history, and level of involvement. Some received short prison terms, while others were given suspended sentences, allowing them to avoid immediate custody, provided they complied with court conditions. The staggered outcomes reflected how a single flashpoint can ripple outward, pulling multiple people into the justice system long after the initial violence ends. Case 9. Jay Abatan went out in Brighton in January 1999, expecting an ordinary night in a city known for its pubs, late-night crowds, and busy streets after closing time. What followed began in a way that felt routine. People leaving venues, taxis in short supply, tempers running thin. But what happened next would become one of the most controversial nightlife-related deaths in modern British history, not only because Jay died, but because of what happened afterward. In the early hours, Jay Abatan became involved in a row over a taxi after leaving a pub. Arguments like this were common at closing time, especially when alcohol was involved and transport options were limited. Witnesses later described a brief confrontation on the street. There was no indication of a planned attack or an organized fight. It was sudden, chaotic, and over in moments. During that confrontation, Jay Abatan was assaulted. He suffered a serious head injury. Emergency services were called, and he was taken to the hospital. At first, there was hope he would recover, but over the following days, his condition worsened. Jay Abatan died days later in the hospital, with medical evidence confirming that the cause of death was the head injury sustained in the assault. Jay was mixed race, and almost immediately his family raised concerns that race may have played a role in what happened. Those concerns would grow louder over the years, becoming central to the legacy of the case. His family has consistently argued that Jay was targeted in a racially motivated attack and that this context was not properly examined by investigators at the time. Police arrested 2 men within 24 hours of the incident. Initially, manslaughter charges were brought, but as the case progressed, prosecutors said there was insufficient evidence to proceed. The manslaughter charges were dropped. The case did not end there, but it did take a dramatic turn. The 2 men were later charged with lesser offenses, including affray and assault on Jay's brother, Michael Abatan, who had also been involved in the aftermath of the confrontation. At trial, those charges did not result in convictions related to Jay's death. The defendants were eventually acquitted, meaning that no one has ever been convicted for killing Jay Abatan. For Jay's family, the legal outcome was devastating. Their son had died from a head injury following an assault, yet the criminal justice system delivered no accountability for his death. The sense of injustice only deepened as serious questions began to emerge about how the investigation had been handled. Years later, a review conducted by Essex Police examined the original investigation carried out by Sussex Police. The findings were damning. The review identified 57 serious errors in the original investigation. Among those failures were findings that officers did not properly secure the crime scene, missed key lines of inquiry, and failed to preserve or gather evidence that could have been crucial. The review also criticized the handling of witnesses and the overall direction of the case during its earliest and most critical stages. Case 10. Craig Gibson was a serving corporal in the British Armed Forces when a night out in Toronto ended with a courtroom verdict that would define the rest of his life. The case centers on a confrontation inside locals only, where a bar argument escalated into a single act of violence that led to the death of Brett Sheffield. What makes this case stand out is not a prolonged fight or a planned attack, but how fast a brief confrontation crossed a line with fatal consequences. On the night of the incident, Craig Gibson and Brett Sheffield were both inside locals only, a bar in downtown Toronto. Court findings later confirmed that an argument broke out inside the venue. There was no evidence of a long-standing feud between the 2 men. The disagreement was sudden and unfolded in a crowded, alcohol-fueled setting where emotions were already heightened. Witnesses described a tense exchange that quickly drew attention from others nearby. The confrontation did not turn into a drawn-out brawl. According to evidence presented at trial, Gibson struck Sheffield once during the argument. There was no weapon involved. The force of the strike caused Sheffield to lose balance and fall. When he hit the ground, his head struck the floor. That impact would become the most critical moment of the entire case. Emergency services were called, and Brett Sheffield was taken to hospital alive. At the time, the seriousness of his condition was not immediately clear to everyone present. He was treated for head injuries, but despite medical intervention, Sheffield later died in hospital. Medical testimony presented in court confirmed that his death was caused by head trauma linked to the fall following the strike. As the investigation unfolded, police focused on the moments inside the bar. There was no suggestion that Gibson intended to kill Sheffield. Instead, prosecutors argued that the strike itself was unlawful and dangerous, and that Gibson should have known the risk of serious harm that could come from hitting someone during an argument. The case moved forward under Canadian criminal law standards, where intent to kill is not required for a manslaughter conviction. The trial became closely watched, in part because of Gibson's status as a British Armed Forces corporal. His military background was discussed in court, but it did not shield him from accountability. The jury was instructed to consider only the facts of what happened inside the bar and whether Gibson's actions directly caused Sheffield's death. After reviewing witness testimony, medical evidence, and legal arguments, the court found Craig Gibson guilty of manslaughter. The verdict underscored a central point in Canadian law. A single act of violence can be enough. You do not need repeated blows. You do not need a weapon. If an unlawful strike leads to death, criminal responsibility follows. The court rejected arguments that the outcome was a tragic accident without legal consequences. Instead, it concluded that the risk of serious injury from such a strike was foreseeable. Case 11. Tony Powell was 62 years old when a night at a local pub in Wakefield ended with injuries that would later take his life. The incident happened on October 9th at the Red Lion, a well-known pub where people regularly gathered for drinks and conversation. What began as an argument inside the venue became the focus of a major police investigation after Powell died in hospital days later. On the evening of October 9th, Tony Powell was inside the Red Lion when an altercation broke out. Early reports described it only as a confrontation, but official police updates later confirmed that officers found Powell suffering from a serious head injury. Emergency services were called, and he was taken to the hospital for treatment. At that stage, the incident was being handled as a serious assault, not a fatal case. Officers attended the pub, spoke with those present, and began collecting initial information about what had happened. Tony Powell remained in hospital for several days. On Wednesday, West Yorkshire Police confirmed that he had died from his injuries. His death marked a turning point in the investigation. What had started as an inquiry into an assault was now treated as a homicide. Detectives were assigned, and the case immediately took on greater urgency. As the investigation developed, West Yorkshire Police released more detailed and concerning findings. Officers requested an urgent review of the Red Lion's premises license, citing serious allegations linked to how the incident was handled inside the pub. According to police documents, investigators believe the pub manager witnessed the assault but failed to call emergency services at the time. This allegation became a major focus of the inquiry. Police further alleged that the manager was under the influence of intoxicating liquor during the incident. Investigators also raised concerns that the area where the assault took place may have been cleaned, potentially removing or damaging forensic evidence that could have helped establish exactly what happened. These claims, outlined in official police paperwork, added a new and troubling dimension to the case. The request for a license review signaled that police concerns extended beyond the altercation itself. In cases like this, licensing reviews are typically sought when investigators believe there may have been serious failures in the duty of care, safety procedures, or legal responsibilities by staff or management. While the review process is separate from the criminal investigation, it reflects the seriousness of the allegations being examined. Police confirmed that a man was arrested in connection with the incident. At the time of reporting, authorities had not publicly named the suspect or announced formal charges. Investigators emphasized that the inquiry was ongoing and that all individuals involved were entitled to due process. CCTV footage from inside the pub, witness accounts, and forensic evidence remain central to the case. As these developments unfolded, Tony Powell's family released a public tribute that added a deeply personal dimension to the story. In their statement, they described him as a much-loved partner, dad, granddad, father-in-law, brother, uncle, and friend. They said he was respected by most and loved by all, words that reflected the scale of loss felt by those closest to him. For the family, the focus shifted from waiting for medical updates to seeking answers about how and why the incident happened. The case has shaken the Wakefield community. The Red Lion was not known as a violent venue, and the idea that a man could suffer fatal injuries during a pub argument has left many residents unsettled. It also raised wider questions about responsibility inside licensed premises, especially when alcohol is involved and tensions rise. From a broader crime documentary perspective, the death of Tony Powell fits a pattern seen in many cases involving bar arguments. These incidents often begin without any clear plan or long-standing conflict. Words are exchanged, tempers rise. A physical act follows. What makes this case stand out is not only the tragic outcome but the allegations that critical steps may not have been taken in the moments that followed. Police have been careful in their language, avoiding speculation while outlining their concerns through official channels. They have urged anyone who was inside the Red Lion on October 9th to come forward with information, stressing that even small details can help establish a clear timeline. Detectives continue to review footage and statements to understand what led to the head injury that ultimately proved fatal. It is important to note that an arrest does not mean a conviction, and that the license review process does not determine criminal guilt. These processes run alongside one another, each with its own legal standards. What they share is a common goal: to establish the truth and ensure accountability where it is required. Case 12. Paul Wallington went out on Christmas Eve 2018, expecting nothing more than a short, festive drink. Within days, he was dead. What happened outside the Vine Bar became one of the most closely scrutinized bar-related deaths in Essex, not just because of the punch itself, but because of everything that followed medically, legally, and publicly. Late on the night of December 24, 2018, as Christmas Day approached, Wallington was among patrons outside the Vine Bar in Brentwood Town Center. The area was busy, emotions were high, and alcohol was involved. An argument broke out. According to evidence later presented in court, the man who struck Wallington was Leslie Wiseman, a door supervisor working at the venue that night. Wiseman was described in trial records as a former prison officer, standing 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing approximately 24 to 25 stone, well over 330 pounds. The physical imbalance between the two men became a key point of focus as the case progressed. What followed lasted seconds. Wiseman struck Wallington once. There was no extended fight and no weapon. The punch caused Wallington to fall backwards, and his head hit the pavement. Witnesses described an immediate collapse. Emergency services were called, and Wallington was taken to the hospital with a serious head injury. At that moment, it appeared he had survived the worst of it. But the danger was already unfolding beneath the surface. Medical evidence later revealed a crucial and complicating factor. Wallington briefly survived the initial injury and was treated in hospital. Despite warnings from doctors about the seriousness of his condition, he discharged himself against medical advice, not once but twice in the days following the assault. Clinicians cautioned him that head injuries can deteriorate without warning. Those warnings proved tragically accurate. His condition worsened rapidly several days later. Official hospital records cite Paul Wallington's death at 3:03 p.m. on December 29, 2018, 5 days after the incident. The cause of death was linked to complications from the head injury sustained when he struck the pavement. This time, gap between the punch and the moment of death would later sit at the heart of the legal battle. Police launched a homicide investigation, and prosecutors charged Leslie Wiseman with manslaughter. The case quickly gained national attention, not because it involved prolonged violence, but because it raised difficult questions about responsibility, causation, and risk. CCTV footage, eyewitness testimony, and medical findings were all placed under intense scrutiny. Prosecutors argued that the initial punch and fall set in motion the fatal chain of events. The defense countered that the medical decisions made afterward broke that chain. The legal process stretched on for years. 2 separate trials were held, and both ended with hung juries, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Jurors struggled with the complexity of the evidence. On one side was the undeniable fact that Wallington had been struck and seriously injured. On the other was the medical reality that he had left the hospital against advice and survived for several days before dying. The question was not emotional, it was legal. Could the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Wiseman's actions alone caused the death? In February 2022, the case reached its conclusion. After the repeated jury deadlocks, the Crown Prosecution Service offered no further evidence. A judge formally entered a verdict of not guilty, and Leslie Wiseman was acquitted of manslaughter. The ruling did not declare the incident harmless. It reflected the high legal threshold required for criminal conviction, especially where medical complexity and delayed death blur direct causation. While the criminal case failed to secure a conviction, the consequences did not end there. Separate licensing proceedings examined the management of the venue itself. In January 2019, just weeks after the incident, the Vine Bar's license was revoked. Licensing authorities cited serious failings in management, including concerns about safety, supervision, and how incidents were handled outside the premises. The bar was shut down, sending a clear message that venues can face severe penalties even when criminal guilt is not established. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel.